I think it's live now. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, did you check?
Yeah, the YouTube stream. Maybe that's the best.
Yeah, I'll check the YouTube.
Well, this is the usual opening of this kind of meetings, just to make sure that the tech is all working and everyone's online and everyone's watching.
That's right. It's all. I saw it. It's there.
Cool. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the panel discussion as part of Ben Gross's exhibition Software for Less. We have Ben Grosser here, Wendy Hui Kyong Chun. Sorry, Wendy, you'll have to.
Well, this is the.
Matthew Fuller and Joana Moll, and my name is Nimrod Vardi. I'm the founder and creative director of Arbeit. A bit of housekeeping. We're just recording this session, this meeting. And if you have any questions, please do ask them in the chat and we'll respond to them at the end or during the conversations. We'll see how it goes. Again, thank you very much for joining us. A bit about Arbeit, if you don't know Arbeit. Arbeit is a non-for-profit organization based in East London, founded in 2013, commissioning artists working in the intersection of digital practices, new technologies, and critical thinking. This event aims to discuss software as culture, the politics of interface, and the power imbalance or balance between user and corporation within today's digital technologies and social media platforms. The panel discussion is part of Software for Less, an exhibition examining the cultural, social, and political effects of software in contemporary society by US artist Ben Grosser. A bit about the exhibition. Software for Less will takes the visitors on a journey through a pseudo-tech exposition. Each work in the exhibition is presented as a product that could have come out of alternative Silicon Valley, interrogating and reimagining how software is created, operated, and sold. The exhibition provokes the viewer to consider the influence of software has on us, foregrounding social media platform as the main impetus. How is an interface that foregrounds of friend count changing our conception of friendship? Who benefits when software system can intuit how we feel, and ultimately questioning how software molds who we are? As I said, we have some very, very interesting panel joining us today. Matthew Fuller is a professor of cultural studies at Goldsmiths University of London. Recent book, Investigative Aesthetics, Bleak Joys, and Software Studies, a Lexicon. He is the co-editor of the journal Computational Culture. Hello, Matthew. We have Joana Moll. She's a Barcelona, Berlin-based artist, researcher whose work critically explores the way techno-capitalist narratives affect the alphabetization of machines, humans, and ecosystems. Recent exhibition venues include Venice Biennale, ZKM, Ars Electronica, and Transmediale. Her projects have been featured in the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Wired, Fast Company, and many others. And Wendy Hui Kyong Chun is a Canada 150 researcher in the new media at Simon Fraser University, where she leads on Digital Democracy Institute. Recent book include Programmed Visions and Updating to Remain the Same. Her book, Discriminating Data, is due to out in November. She is previously the chair of modern culture and media at Brown University. Thank you for joining us. And of course, Ben Grosser an artist focuses on the cultural effects of software. Recent exhibition venues include the Barbican Center in London, Museum Kunst Castle House in Berlin, Museum des Comunigas in Lisbon, and Gallery Charlot in Berlin. His work has been featured in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Guardian, and many others. And of course, he got a show with us now at the gallery. Saturday is the last day, and we have an artist talk and a tour. You're all very, very welcome. So thank you all for joining us today, this evening. And Ben, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Nimrod. Happy to be here, and thank you to everyone for coming together around this. I really appreciate it and appreciate your time. This is essentially my dream panel. So it's not often you get your dream panel. So what what I've done for us today is I really just prepared some questions around kind of some of the themes of the show, but also thinking about themes within the work that you all do in your various outputs. And I really just mean them as a way to kind of generate conversation around the idea of software as culture. And we can veer in whatever way is possible. So I'll start off with question one, and we'll see how it goes. Within the landscape of opaque feed algorithms, unpredictable recommendation systems, and other black box decision systems used by today's big tech platforms, users have been conditioned to make themselves as legible as possible. Thus, likes and follows and content views and other signals are not only enacted by users to record presence and/or consume media, but are also central actions users employ with hopes of gaining visibility and influencing that landscape. And so that's kind of the intro to the question, which is, what are the effects of this conditioned need to show ourselves to algorithms? And how does it circumscribe our ability to imagine agency within computational spaces? And I'll let anyone kind of choose to start there.
Well, I mean, one thing that would be to take a link from some of the work in the show, and I think one of the things that the show is extremely good at is showing the way in which universals or proposed universals are produced out of very thin set of grammar of activities. So the way in which the different works show that the language of interface that's available through something like Facebook, of liking, of sharing, of carrying out a very small set of actions, then gets turned into a kind of linguistic procedure, which can then get replicated. And this produces a kind of unending sentence of actions, which are programmatic actions at one level, but they're also linguistic actions that look like social effects, and they have social effects. So what's interesting, I think, there is what you show. You show the absurdity of these kind of structures by taking them at face value. And there's very much this reading the interface for the statement it makes. So it's almost as if you were putting Facebook down on the couch and listening to it. What is it? What is it? What are you saying about your mother, Facebook? Oh, I like my mother, and so on. And this is what it can say. And this is its unconscious. And its unconscious is really thin, really brittle, and it's fraying at the edges. It can't contain all that humanity is surging into it. And this is where the problems start. So I'd say one way is language.
Yeah, thank you for that, Matthew. Obviously I couldn't disagree. And more than that, I fully agree. I think, the project that I have in there now, and the new ones for this show, Platform Sweet Talk, that just really grows out of literally reading and trying to capture all of the notification sentences, the grammar of notifications that Facebook is producing for the user, and coming to a realization over a amount of time that I honestly underestimated how vast that grammar was. Just how many different variations there. It almost feels infinite sometimes. It's not infinite, but it's hundreds and hundreds of different sentences and different structures that are really just meant to drop in. That are designed to drop in your information. And once you take your slot in the database out of those sentences, you realize just how there's nothing there. They just rely on your name and the names of your friends and things like that to try to key you in. Anyway,
for me, one of the things, maybe it is a little bit, I mean, it's related to the topic, but for me, one of the things that I like the most of your work, and I've been a fan for years, it's when you make all these interfaces naked, like, or you question them by especially taking things out, especially in the case of the metricator and others, is that you unveil much more. It's not that you take out and something become less all of a sudden, no? You just reveal, especially like the business model and all these apparatus that forces all these users to keep on producing data, because this is what these companies actually need, because they feed on raw data. Yeah, now let's not forget that Facebook primary business model is ad tech. Yeah, so they really need massive amounts of data to keep nurturing their money-making machine. And I think that you do it in a very subtle, not violent way, which I think it's so obvious and it smashes you in the face almost, no? Like, that's what it is, right? Take the numbers, there is no business model, there is no company. And it's such a small, tiny turn, yeah? And yet it's so powerful. And I really love this about, I think it's something that's very present in all of your works. And I think that's super, really powerful. And for me, it's been a great inspiration for do a lot of the workshops I do. I mean, related with interface and energy, but following this idea of just modifying a tiny bit, just to reveal like a whole world and a whole huge machinery that is super obfuscated behind the interface. So I think, I'm not sure if this answers your question, just was keeping the conversation. I think it was worth mentioning this.
Well, I appreciate it. Like I said, it doesn't need to go in any particular directions, but it was really part of what I was thinking about is this kind of the way in which the designs of these systems encourage us to make ourselves legible. They kind of put this burden on the user of, like, you just need to tell me more about yourself. Like, if you're not getting what you want from the system, then that's not something we've done poorly. It's that you haven't given us enough. So that was part of what I was thinking about with that question.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, because one thing that these systems demand, and not just these systems, but one can think through the political structure right now, is the demand to be authentic. And the idea that one is authentic when one reveals an open secret about oneself, when one's inside and outside correspond. And I think that the playing with the internal and the external, or the idea that these two should be conflated, is actually really powerful in terms of thinking of the ways in which your projects disrupt habit. Because what habit does, of course, is take something external, like a notification. You start gaining a habit when you have this external notification, but then it becomes internal. So you actually don't need the notification anymore, because you've internalized the act of liking, looking, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one thing that your work does is to actually keep accentuating the external, and the role the external plays in order to move us away from simply internalizing it, or to be aware of the ways in which we've internalized it. And I think this larger question of external, internal, this drive to be quote unquote authentic, is also something that we can trouble in terms of agency when we think of habit seriously as second nature. What habit implies and brings out is that humans are fundamentally creative, that we create another form of nature, that we're characters, not marionettes. And I think that thinking through that is one way to get at a fundamental opacity that exists even when we're called on to be legible and transparent.
I think there's maybe two works in the show, Ben, that does respond. Maybe there's a lot more works in the show that respond to that, but the two that comes to mind is Not For You, with the way that it obfuscates the user and changes the entire TikTok, that is the method of TikTok, and creating something that is not authentic anymore, that it's not yourself, that it's someone that is not you. It's maybe almost the complete opposite. And then another work is Platform Sweet Talk, with the notification that it brings and the way they lose the user to continue absorb and engage with the platform. It's an ongoing relationship that just needs to be well, I guess similar to order of magnitude to an extent, just more and more, and just keeps bringing you into the same chamber that you're always stuck within. And of course, there's so many other works in the show, and general works of yours that do kind of emphasize on this need of the user and platform relationship, and it's a never-ending type of relationship.
I think one of the things that maybe is something prompted by what Wendy said around the inside and the outside should correspond within these systems, and that one should answer to one's true name. You should be registered within your true identity and reveal yourself, to confess to the social media machine. But it's also interesting that the inside and the outside are also, and the comparison between them are also one of the tools, one of the central tools of critique. That we look under the bonnet in order to see the machine. So that the critical mode is often about seeing what's inside and say, okay, they're doing this on the surface, but actually underneath there's all these other processes going. And in a way, the critical mode asks the same of Facebook as that Facebook asks of us, is if to ask for a reciprocal relationship. I wonder, on the one hand, whether there's a potential politics there of reciprocal exchange of information, or whether something that Wendy also said, with there's an opacity, a necessary opacity, which has been an absolute part of 20th century aesthetics, to think of impossibilities of representation. And maybe there's a tension there in the work and in the issues we're talking about, that is maybe the tools of critique aren't quite right anymore, in a sense. Maybe the tools that you're offering, or the way of thinking about these things, is to act and create different centers of power, different kind of momentum, different kinds of force that change relations of power. And that the critique and confession as the kind of two modes of balancing the inside and outside, maybe we're at a turning point where something else is happening.
Yeah, that's all of that really gets me thinking about, there's one of the things I end up thinking about is the position from which one critiques the system, and the complications that arise. I suspect Joana, I know, thinking about Joana's work, I can only imagine this has happened for her too, but it's, how much you can, or how much you're able to critique a system from within that system, or how much do you have to step outside the system and look at it in order to see it? It's like, where do you see it? And I think part of from my perspective, part of the complication of being critical of Facebook, being critical of TikTok, is that to understand TikTok is to be lost in TikTok. It's like, it's not that you can't be critical and can't have a strong critical vantage point from outside the system, but there's also something about the affective experience of feeling the need to flip to the next video, of feeling that moment when you, in my opinion, buy into the mythology of its famed AI feed algorithm, that it really gets you, and being able to then find a vantage point. And from my perspective, I find it both valuable to get lost and really feel the push and pull, the affective push and pull that the systems produce in me through its interface. But at the same time, it means I really do get lost in it, and that sometimes means I can't see. It's difficult to know what I'm looking at, and I just really have to muddle my way through it. I don't know if Joana, if that has any.
Absolutely. I was thinking like how obsessively, I'm checking my Twitter feed a lot of times, and it just like, Yeah, it's a bit schizophrenic a lot of times, because indeed, I do believe that you have to go really deep into these systems and be like a user that's been, like, as you said, like really immersed into all these platforms in order to be able to criticize them. But at the same time, I think you also miss a lot of points, and you miss perspective in many ways. So this process of detaching, I think we just detach a little bit, because I think that there is a lot that we are unable to see. Like, a lot of times I thought that I've never been in Silicon Valley, for example. I've never been sitting in an office of somebody working at Google, or having a coffee with an engineer. And I think that's something that is also really needed to understand all the culture that is being then sort of put into all the design of these platforms. So I think that we can do, I think what Ben, you and I think we share, we just detach, like we detach a part, we criticize a part of the user, which I think is what we can reach. But indeed, it's really, really hard. And a lot of times, I'm not sure how effective it is. Yeah, but it's hard. It's because also you question your own means of critique, right? It's exactly what Matthew said. Is it valid this anymore? Is it not valid? I have no idea. And sometimes I also doubt it. It's really a process. Yeah, I wish I would have an answer for that. But yeah, it's schizophrenic. And it don't really, yeah. A lot of times I feel we do a lot of instinctive work as well.
Although, I mean, what's arguably compelling about a lot of your work, Ben, is that you don't go into it. Like, if you think through the more or less, right? It's the answer is there. It's in your face. You don't need to go into it. What you show is that is there, present. And I wonder it all too, because for Not For You, you say that you mix things up, not for you, to make TikTok less addictive. But I wonder if it really does do that.
Yeah, I mean, you mean if it really makes TikTok less addictive for the user?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, it's pretty difficult. One of the things I found in making it and running it and trying it is that it's tremendously difficult to push that algorithm in any way. It seems, I mean, I would go through all these different test accounts and trying to experiment with, like, well, what if I give it this kind of a signal? What if I push it in this direction? What if I let it wander over here? And what I would see over and over again is it just kept feeding me the same kind of thing. No matter how much I told it, I don't want this and I don't want that, it would say, well, how about more of this? How about more of that? I mean, this is where I honestly think that ByteDance, TikTok, has benefited from a mythology, like they've generated and allowed a mythology to kind of proliferate through the journalistic discussion of their company, that and the users understanding of it, that they really they have the best AI ever that really gets you. And I think really what's missing in that critique, and where Not For You doesn't really address this at all in its intervention, which is that it's not that the algorithm understands people, it's that the design of the interface and the type of the structure of the content makes people forget about the things they're not interested in and remember the things they do find interesting. It makes it so easy to flip past. And it also makes it so that the user feels like there's such low cost to trying another video because it's maybe only 15 seconds at most. And even so, I can flip past it if I don't like it. That just makes me keep going. Flip, 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 flip. Oh, it gets me here. This one is good. Flip, 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 like again. So I don't know. I don't think it does, Wendy, but I'm not even sure it's doing the right thing. It's just, it's an experiment.
Yeah, no, I know Matthew wants to get in, but I just want to say one thing really quickly along that line. I think that one definition of ideology that I find completely compelling is Richard Dean's notion, which is that ideology always misses. It's broadcast, it's just sent out there. And it's actually the subject that closes the loop by overhearing or eavesdropping. something that's not meant for it, but it closes and short circuits it so the message hits. And I think that might be one way of thinking through what's happening, and the idea that, this could be total BS. TikTok could be, what you could have shown is TikTok shows everybody the same thing, right? And everybody nonetheless somehow feels that this is personalized to them. Because of precisely those issues of structure that you bring up. And so the depth, or what Matthew was talking about in terms of the desire for cultural critique, or to pick up the underside, is what drives this belief in this profoundly personalized system, rather than the other way around.
You're on mute, Matthew.
The systems are also designed to kind of hijack and reroute human capacity for empathy, projection, transference, to read emotion and intent into the behavior of simple procedures, simple interface elements, and so on. And that's a really potent thing. So that, and many systems historically have done this. Religions, tarot cards, any kind of oracle system, we believe it's going to tell us something, and because we transfer that belief, it is able to tell us something, and so we get something out of the transaction. But what it is debatable in some way. And we need to learn the skills to read it in a proper manner. But I think one of the things that both you and Joana do is really this adding additional machines to these machines, so you're not simply watching and getting befuddled. You're kind of rerouting them and making other compositions out of them. So adding assemblages to assemblages, and I think that's a really interesting way of working that both of you have.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's just, I guess one reaction I still have to that too is the way in which I'm still puzzling with this a little bit in my head as I think about TikTok and its role and kind of its place, but the way in which it sets up a system by which the best way to express creativity within its platform is a form of mimicry. I mean, that's kind of what that's part of what it sets up, is that if you want to be part of this culture, then the way to be part of this culture is to show that you get it by doing the same thing that everyone else is doing. And thinking, Wendy, about your suggestion that maybe everybody's just seeing the same thing, right? Like that would be an effective way of kind of reinforcing that idea that we're just supposed to do what everybody else is doing. I think it's maybe a little bit more sophisticated than that, and that it feels mostly just like the YouTube algorithm to me, where it's kind of like you watch one cat video, now you get 100,000 cat videos suggested to you. Or really, maybe you watch one cat video, you get 10, you watch 2 cat videos, you get 100, you watch 3 cat videos, you get 1,000, whatever it is. It's not, it's just, it figures out, it's kind of characterizes you based on all of the data it's got about everybody else and what they've watched previously. Maybe it would make sense for me to move to another question, unless anybody had another thought along those lines. So here's question 2. Big tech has normalized the idea that endless growth is unavoidable, speed is desirable, and scale is a requirement for platform success. Yet every platform that conforms to these norms always ends up with a host of problems, from the viral spread of mis or disinformation, to the amplification of racism, to the erosion of democracy. To what extent do you see today's platform problems as rooted in Silicon Valley's focus on scale and growth and speed? And what, if any, future opportunities do you see in a return to smaller scale online communities?
I mean, I think one response would be to say it's not just Silicon Valley; it's capitalism, which is reaching its limits in terms of what it can do to the planet in terms of extraction and despoliation. Globalization over the past few decades has, created a single platform planet to some extent, which is one based around the ideas of certain kinds of market being the primary form of human interaction. And Silicon Valley's zero to one strategy is essentially to establish global monopolies within that space. And in a sense, one could say, okay, that all they're doing is corresponding to the globalization of capitalism. And in order to survive in that space, which has been developed for hundreds of years, this is at the point they're at the moment. And one could say, okay, they're cynical, they're ruthless, but there's something more fundamental that we have to work out and to go beyond, which is we have to get rid of capitalism ultimately as a system, because it is just trashing the planet and it's unsustainable. And Silicon Valley is a victim of that. We have to weep for these people.
I think I also did totally. That's a nice point. I also think that in terms of what we could do on looking at the weak points, I think that those infrastructures, even if they are supranational and they seem they are super powerful and super resilient, I think we need to remember that they are really, really fragile in the sense that they're so hierarchized, and like the central powers are very well placed in a way that if something fails, and we saw it what happened with the Facebook a few weeks ago, right? Like the whole platform failed. And I think this can act, or it's the same case with most of the super infrastructures that run ultra capitalism at large. And I think there is a lot of things to explore there in this fragility that we don't tend to see, but it's there. Something fails. It's same with the internet, like if Ashburn goes, the internet mostly goes. If Amazon goes, which every 3 hops you have like an Amazon server, the internet goes. And when this goes and when this collapses, there is like a lot of space for the thing to flourish, because probably when these things happen, people can organize much more in a local space. It's like, okay, internet is not reliable, those things are failing. And then obviously we still need to communicate, and then we just do more contextualized structures, right? And I think that's like something that's very, very worth exploring, because as I said, I don't think we tend to see these infrastructures as fragile.
And just to add to what's been said, I would also push back a little bit on the idea that smaller communities are somehow better, because surveillance in small communities is really good. And your neighbor knows what you're doing. There's a way in which smaller isn't necessarily better, and I think maybe the way that Matthew's framed it in terms of capitalism is one way to think through this, because I know that you've been doing like really great work trying to think through minusing and degrowing, and what would that look like, and degrowing is different than making smaller, because in a capitalist system you could be degrowing just to maintain the same, right? And so perhaps one thing is thinking through that relationship, and also what I find so profoundly disturbing about the way Silicon Valley operates is its mode of organization, right? So so a lot of the recommender systems, of course, are based on homophily, the notion that similarity breeds connection, right? Which has profound ties in US residential segregation. But so what it does is it creates agitated clusters of comforting rage, right? Because this homophily is allegedly put in place because it's believed that somehow if you're around people who are like you, you're more comfortable. And what the Facebook leaks showed is, like, when they did that, put you with people like you, friends and families, it got angrier. Like these people had never spent time in a family vacation or something, like just completely ignored personal experience. So I think this mode of organization to create this anger which actually makes us more predictable in the sense that when you're angry or agitated, you're far more likely to be triggered. And therefore, to also take these tarot cards, as Matthew put it, and understand it as you, right, is really disturbing. And I think it gets to what Joanne has been saying about how fragile they are too, because if it's based on constant agitation and circulation and intensity, there's a way in which that can never always work, or that it creates its own modes of failure that are really important to think through. And I think those modes of failure aren't simply making things smaller, but doing something else.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. I think I've been maybe the reason I'm thinking and put, could smaller provide some benefit, is partially based in the monopoly tactics of Peter Thiel and the rest to absorb everything into one system. And of course, as Matthew aptly points out, they're just doing what the system already set up for them. But I often think about there's a way in which the mode of practice in Silicon Valley, maybe it's just kind of the perfect storm of the technology enables the co-option of individuals into a global whole. One of the things I learned from doing the Zuckerberg supercut was, there are these certain numbers that keep going up throughout his history, first 15 years of Facebook. And one of those numbers is the user number. And he keeps citing how many users he has. And it's just going up and up and up until he gets to about 2 billion, at which points, while he still says what number he's at, he starts talking about a different number, which is how many he has left to get. And he switches into that mode of like, how can he capture the last remaining 6 billion or whatever it is. And it's often, I end up thinking about how the Silicon Valley is always, as one example of this kind of a problem, they generate their platforms with an all-encompassing focus on scale and growth, getting as big as possible, getting everybody on the platform. And then they start that introduces a whole host of problems, which, in the case of what Wendy's talking about, right, it's one of those is that anytime they try to correct and go for a local focus as opposed to a global focus, it creates all these micro communities of rage and allows white supremacy to emerge in ways that hadn't done in however long. And yet at the same time, they then introduce, they keep introducing things they think are fixing the problems. That's where algorithmic feeds come from. It's like once you get so many people on a platform, then you've got too much information for people to focus on, and they get frustrated. They can't find what matters to them. And so then they say, well, we'll fix it. We'll make an algorithmic feed. And of course, the algorithmic feed then ends up encoding the way they think about what's important versus what anybody else might think is important, and reinforces a certain way of thinking on to everyone on the platform. I think that's part of what made me think about smaller, and maybe by smaller, I'm simply meaning not everyone all in one place, which is kind of the way they think about it. But I appreciate the points, and it's this complication between everyone connected and everyone all in one conversation. I think it's part of what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a kind of utopic dimension to Facebook, which is really naive and really brutal. But there is a kind of utopic dimension that is, there's something interesting about it, but about its clumsiness. But it's something that's spreading across the world at the same time as the world is coming to the end of certain kinds of global systems are collapsing, at the same time as Facebook is growing and collapsing in on itself. So we're seeing multiple dynamics playing out through Facebook, that we're coming to the end of a certain kind of economic model's ability to run off the ecological basis of the planet. We're coming to the end of a certain, or at least the possible end of certain kinds of societal privilege, or at least strong contestation of them. And all of these things which are, happening partly through platforms like Facebook and others, are also wrecking its ability to provide a universal, because its universal is based around very simplistic, very kind of minimal and proprietary models of what human communication can be, or what universals might be, or an imagined universal or imagined utopia might be. And it's a very interesting collision of multiple kinds of collapse. I mean, you can see, if Arbeit is situated in the UK, you can see Brexit, for instance, as one of these moments of rejection of a certain form of globalization, but that comes in a reactionary mode because that's what's made available to people. And this we can see is also something that occurs through the mechanisms of Facebook and others. The Cambridge Analytica scandal being one of the many kind of iterations of this. And so if we see Facebook not simply as one entity, but as a ground where multiple systems that are emerging, collapsing, grinding against each other are articulated and bear certain kind of traces at certain moments in certain ways, even at the level of millions of data points or at the level of minute data points, we're able to see a more complex system, in which Facebook is fragile and as Joana says, is potentially able to fall apart very fast. We remember Geospace, or GeoCities, or MySpace, and so on. Maybe in 5 years' time we'll be thinking of another system, but it's this interesting moment of a universal utopia which is being sold back as a service. What we need to do is, rather than sell it as a service, actually, start instantiating some kind of system that would have more of a utopian dimension. I see the police in the background. In your
Just one note in this idea of collapse, and it's just like a very small anecdote that I shared with you when we changed some emails. I'm reading this super interesting book about scaling. And the author, which I can't remember the name, says that it's sort of a standard, it's sort of like a law that they don't know how it can be proven or how this happens yet, but it tends to happen, which companies tend to collapse when they reach 500,000 net worth, 500 billion net worth. I'm not sure how far Facebook and all these giant ITs are from that. But I think it's going to be interesting, because I don't think they are so far, and I think it's going to be interesting how they're going to fall. And I think they're going to just be spread in small entities. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think we should be aware of that. It'll be very interesting.
So you think the best thing to do would be to increase their share price?
Absolutely. Let's just feed them as much as we can. Let's just give them all the data, everything, like all our finger movements, anything we can. And then we'll see what happens. I mean, I think it could be like a reverse, mode, because we tend that the protection is to give them less and to subtract our attention and to just go out and again do like something in smaller communities. No, we just need to, accelerate their own decay.
But we might end up like Nick Land then.
Absolutely.
The one data point I could add here is that Facebook was the fastest company to achieve a $1 trillion valuation in the history of capitalism, 17 years. So they've passed we should look and see when the $500 billion mark happened, and maybe that's 2016 or 2015 or so in Facebook's history. Maybe I'll move on to the next one here. So,
but just the question was like
yeah.
the valuation in the market, it was like the value of all their assets.
It's the capitalization in the market.
Okay, because I think like what it counted the assets actually.
Oh,
so yeah, I think that's what this guy said in this book.
All right, so big tech's focus on growth and scale that we've been talking about, very much from my perspective, is in service of the thing they most seek, which is more. It seems to fit the $1 trillion valuation we've been talking about. So this want is fundamental, driving how their software works, what it does, and what it makes possible or impossible. It's what leads them to engineer features such as visible light counts or algorithmic feeds or endless notifications, because those interface elements all help them gain more users, more data, and thus more profit. One of my ideas behind this exhibition has been to invert their fundamental focus on more by imagining what I call software for less. In other words, software that by design wants less users, less data, or less profit. I wonder whether you think such a proposition has potential beyond the boundaries of anti-capitalist, artistic, or academic projects. And further, are there other areas of society beyond social media, for example, where a focus on software for less might gain allies?
Well, an easy one is global climate change, right? I think that the ways in which that demand is for less, literally, like in terms of electricity, feed, etc. I mean, by quote unquote saving things, we're just destroying the planet by putting them on the cloud. But I think there's a different way in which, just from what you said earlier, we can think through a relationship that's productive between global climate change and social media. Because as you pointed out, social media has been always trying to fix its problems, right? The idea is, okay, we've caused this, so let's try to fix it doing X, Y, and Z. And that's the logic of geoengineering, right? So geoengineering is like, okay, well, this is happening, but in order to, we're going to keep the growth going, but we're going to do these things that will have the same kind of impacts that the feed changes will have. In other words, it'll make things profoundly worse. And so if there's a way in which we can map out the interventions within social media to engineer a solution leading to things that are far worse, and link that to the promises of geoengineering and the fundamental premise of global climate change activists, which is we just need less. And that's a very profound and difficult yet simple message.
Sorry, Matthew, I thought I saw your...
No, I was just trying to speak less, actually, but sorry.
Well done. We're done. That's great.
No, I entirely agree with Wendy. I think that's a very important point. And a lot of this can be done through engineering approaches as well. I mean, I think it's important not to demonize solutions, but to recognize the certain kind of an ideology of solutions. And think about, okay, the recent controversy at Google around transformer algorithms, for instance, and large language models, led by Margaret Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, I thought was a very, very good point that, if you use more lean, more elegant algorithms, that require perhaps more sophisticated coding, maybe you'll get some things that don't cause so much climate damage. And this is in an era of kind of resource intensity of the cloud, but also of large language models, of machine learning and so on. Perhaps a return to the values of terseness and precision in coding and algorithm design that was found in the 60s with people like Dijkstra, and in coding with people like Donald Knuth. Maybe this could also be a mode of less that's based around a certain appreciation of elegance.
Yeah, in terms of, I mean, I think it's a really good point. But in terms of applying these methods, and I think it happens. It's a bit the same fallacy of to produce green technology, we need to use a lot of not green technology, right? And what happens with a lot of platforms, especially with Google, there's something called legacy code, or code legacy in English. I'm not really sure, which is like a lot of the new platforms are based in very old code that cannot be touched, just like an archaeological, layers of code. So to build very simple code, you have also to rely in all this legacy code. It's much more energy intensive, but it's built on top, right? And a lot of times I wonder if it's actually possible to undo all this code and start from zero without all these platforms crashing, which I think would be a great experiment. Then maybe that's also a way that capitalism would crash, right? By attaching these layers of code. But I'm just wondering, like, how feasible this is to build like really low energy code that's actually as low energy as they say it is, right? I'm just wondering. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, I just to be frank, I mean, Joanna, I think of some of your projects that try to make visible for anyone, everyday users, just to give them even any idea of what's literally happening when you type one word into this single box on a clean white web page and say, tell me the answer, and how that activates an infrastructure. I mean, even how an entire infrastructure was activated in the hopes that you might type that word someday in the future, so that it could be ready with an answer. And every time I show that, your projects to students or colleagues, it's such a quick way of getting across the vastness that's hidden by the facade of the interface. And I think that's part of what I think about with the potential for kind of animating people into ideas about less. And I agree with Wendy and Matthew here on the kind of like the environmental movement, and climate change as climate crisis as the kind of a central focus of a collection of individuals that are going to maybe be motivated by the idea of less in the first place, and trying to draw parallels to the ways in which the designs of software, and in particular the aims of interface, end up trying to hide as much as possible of what's behind the scene. I mean, certainly all the legacy code that you're talking about, I mean, that leads me to think about the fragility aspects we were talking about earlier, that it's so much work to even undo. And if you, let's say the aspiration was to be elegant, was to rethink. I mean, there's whole books on, what happens when software developers and software development companies refactor with the name to like fix all of the old problems that they've inherited. And of course, they just end up rebuilding many of them because it turns out there's a lot of time and effort into debugging that's built into that legacy code that is maybe no longer visible because the people who did that work are moved on to other things, or they've forgotten what they did in the first place. So I do, personally, I think anywhere in the various systems we contend with, whether it's a computational system and platforms, whether it's climate systems and how our actions are influencing them, bringing to the foreground all of the things that are happening under the scenes that are trying to make it simple and easy for everyone to do what they're doing without having to think about it is part of what I end up thinking about with this question.
Yeah, I love the CO2 goggle.
Yeah.
And I think that gets to some of the issues that we've been thinking through. But then it is this interesting use of the interface itself, right? To make it. And I think this gets to the bizarre discussion of us discussing less when, as Matthew pointed out, part of what you all do is do more, as artists, right? You know,
Yes.
so it's the logic of more within an economy of less is what we're moving towards, right? Or trying to think through and what that would look like. And how could we make that seductive or interesting? How could we make it something that is, because, you know, to give it an entirely different and bizarre analogy, this whole conversation made me think about dieting, right? And so, like, the goal behind dieting is somehow to make less sexy, right? And so in the United States, it's about exercising, because you can't possibly consume less, right? This would be a bad thing. So you have to exercise and therefore degrade your body as you're trying to maintain a certain form, as you're within negotiating these calls both to eat more as a sign of love, but never gain weight as a sign of love. So, but I do think that something about this bizarre negotiation of more and less in terms of our bodies and our habits, again, to get to the question of the habitual, or what would it mean to have agency? What would it mean to make the interior and the exterior do something else? I think it might be really interesting to focus it once more on our bodies. Because just, you know, one of the most compelling things that has been written about global climate change and how to deal with global climate change is that move from focusing on the mean. This is Jim Hanson's work, right? So Jim Hanson, NASA's climate scientist, for the longest time thought if people only knew, right? If people only knew, they would act differently. And then he's like, no, doesn't make a difference. But what he says is part of it because a mean is something very different to experience. You don't experience mean temperature, you experience weather. And one side effect of global climate change are weird weather events. So events which are 3 standard deviations from the norm have increased. So his argument is, given the increase of these standard deviations, which people experience as deviations, this can be a way, global weirding, to understand and comprehend and experience what seems inexperienceable, which is climate. So I wonder if there might be, and again, this is a side effect rather than a direct cause or effect. And I wonder if part of the work is thinking through these side effects that are viscerally felt or engaged with, that can get us towards these other issues precisely because they do so obliquely.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of things that leads on from that is the ability of novel kinds of sensing capacities to understand and to register or make sense of things like climate damage. You know, so if Jim Hanson's saying yes, it's difficult for humans to understand a mean and to experience a mean. You know, that's because we haven't evolved to do that, but we can work with things like sensors that detect different kinds of gases and temperatures, the presence of certain kinds of chemical compounds, and so on, and then develop systems to understand that data and make it sensible, make it tractable. So that's another example of adding rather than asking for less, in a sense, and to expand the domain of the sensible through practice of aesthetic sensing. And I think maybe that's something that has a lot of possibility. But then the question is, okay, what are the terms by which things are added? What are the things that are made when additions come about? And there's a very nice part of research in hacking and security research called LangSec, which is language security, and they have a term called weird machines. When one kind of program is attached to another program that may be just a very simple one, like a website, and it's very similar in a way to the work that Ben and Joana are doing, that adds processes to other processes in order to make them function differently. And one of the things we need to do in some ways is to find ways of adding processes to existing systems as they grow and fall apart and collapse, that make sense of being alive in different ways, but also make ecological conditions just for people and for animals, for ecology, and so on. So the thing that Wendy's pointing to, I think, is really important. You know, this capacity of adding and aesthetics of addition that might be at the core of what we're looking at.
Yeah, it's such a I love Matthew's answer where he didn't answer right away. I mean, it's like, it's so hard to do. It's so hard to just say the best thing I can do for this situation, for this problem in the world, is to do nothing. And I mean, collectively, we seem to do that all the time as a society, but to do nothing about some of the world's worst problems. But the individual way to participate in culture is to participate in society, is to contribute, which is almost inevitably like, I have my way, my additional way of doing something. Even, you know, in my own gestures towards erasure, of course, they take a lot of effort to add in order to make the erasure possible. And in fact, even slow things down and burn more cycles on CPUs. And, you know, like there's no, it's very difficult to escape as a, just overall, it's difficult to escape that. Let me just pause and just see if, before I would kind of keep going, because we're about an 8:30, I want to see, Nimrod, are there questions coming in from YouTube that we should be thinking about?
There are a couple of questions, but maybe also trying to again contextualize this question. Maybe after that, you would like to focus on minus as your kind of suggestion of removing a lot of the more and a lot of the over engagement with the platform. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, or do you want me to ask the question that's here?
Oh, that's kind of you. I mean, I'll take one thing from that, and I'll just, it's an observation that I have from watching activity on Minus over the last couple of months, and I'm still thinking about it a lot, even what it is, what it might turn into, which seems to change all the time. But one of the things I most notice as a reaction to the idea of, here is a platform upon which you're not asked to focus on accumulation, and you're not asked to provide endless participation, but instead it starts with the premise that your opportunities are limited, is that so many people, when faced with that, you have 100 posts for life, is at first they say, how could that's so small, I don't even know what to do with it. And then they say, I'm not really sure what to do with my second post. Like, they do number one that complains about the limit, and then they're like, yeah, I'm not sure what to say now. And I think, you know, it's that when they're faced with the idea that something is limited, all of a sudden they feel a weight. They feel like they're supposed to think more deeply about what they do. And then when they're not used to that in the social media space, because that's not how social media is designed. It's designed to animate us into endless production. And so a platform that asks you to limit your production, or enforces a limit on production, ends up stopping some people in their tracks. They don't even know what to do with it. Of course, I'm always thinking about, who said you had to, well, here's one thing that happens, like I've seen this many times, which is people go, okay, well, I think I'm going to live for another 40 years. And so if I divide 40 years by 100 posts, then that gives me one post every 143 days. So here's number one, and I'll see you 143 days. And it reveals the way in which the platforms have led us to think that they're with us forever, that we'll never escape them. And we need to curate our entire lives with the idea that they'll be with us. So one thing I hope that Minus does, and I think it does for some people, is it at least forces them to have to think about the difference between a platform that wants infinite and a platform that wants limit, and how that gets them to, how that reveals the way we were already thinking about what it means to be on a platform that has no limits, or that we think has no limits. Of course, they all do, but. Yeah, I don't know, Nimrod, do you want to
Yeah.
read a question?
So there's a question from Robert Good. First of all, I loved your exhibition and feel very sympathetic to its perspective. But can you speak about any positives that you might see from the current online environment, or do you see it as an entirely problematic? Is it all very bad, basically?
It's a classic, where's the optimist? Like, what's the optimistic take kind of, I'm not the optimist in the room generally when it comes to the platforms. At the same time, I do think part of what's interesting, part of what's interesting about them is there is a reason that so many people are there, and it's not only monopoly power. I have gained connections with individuals who I wouldn't have otherwise without the platforms. I think the reason I'm often so pessimistic is because we have privatized what should be fundamental public infrastructure, and we've abdicated our responsibility as a society to take on the development of things that society needs, that society can benefit from, with computational infrastructure that we've left in the hands of a single individual. In the case of Facebook, I don't know. Do I see positives? I have trouble. I see a lot of negatives. Maybe somebody else can help me with the positives.
I'm never the optimist in the room either when it comes to platforms, but I think that I saw a lot of positives in the past, but I don't see a lot of positives in the future. I can't see how these platforms can help climate change, for instance, or can help reverse any of the process or dynamics that are basically destroying our planet. I can't see it. I can't.
I wonder if, with nostalgia being involved, whether in 20 years' time we'll kind of look back at 2005 or 6 and think, oh, the good old days when Facebook just started, or the good old days when MySpace was there. And as the world becomes, I guess, more and more pessimistic, whether this becomes an optimistic point of view then. But I don't know. I don't know how was MySpace when it started, because I didn't really use it.
I have something good to say. I think that this discussion in social media will hopefully get us away from even talking about optimism versus pessimism. Because I think that may be part of the problem. And here I think Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism is just brilliant. And I also think that framing things in terms of being optimistic or pessimistic about a platform takes us away from some of the fundamental issues around technology, which isn't should we be optimistic or pessimistic about it, right? And optimism, it's fundamental to technologies, right? So if you think of how these machine learning algorithms work, they work through optimization. So I think that the discussions that have emerged from this will hopefully move us away from conversations of optimism versus pessimism because they're so complicated. I also think that, we could say what else has been interesting about social media. It's brought out painfully clear some of the problems that we face, and by making and framing that people are willing to admit to issues around polarization, racism, discrimination, etc., when it's seen through the rubric of social media or some of these algorithms, in ways that they haven't or wouldn't face them otherwise, right? So they'll say, oh, this is a discriminatory algorithm, or this is problematic because it does X, Y, and Z, but they won't be able, and because it's framed in this way, more alliances are being able to be made through people from civil rights and civil liberties that might not have been possible otherwise, except through this perversion, etc. The other thing I would say that's good about this is that it brings out the ways in which we're fundamentally interconnected. There's one way to view it, which is to say that these are these companies manipulating us, which true. But the other way to view it is that they operate by us constantly being in contact with each other and with each other's signals. So it brings out a profound understanding of connectivity, or could bring out a profound understanding of connectivity that haven't been there before. One could also say that this idea of limitlessness is interesting in a system that's fundamentally built on the idea of limited resources and conflict. So could there be, like, ecology, is kind of a nasty discipline, right? It's the economics of the natural world, and it's based on competition, and you win when your genes make it to the next generation, whether or not you're miserable. There's a fundamental belief that there are conflict over everything, like food, etc., and that this is a mode of optimization. So is there a way in which this fake plenitude or imagining of something could be productive in terms of using it to critique or to think through the limits of narratives of limits? Is it a good way for us to conceptualize and understand the ways in which frontier capitalism has operated through a certain notion of limitlessness inscribed on limits? So I think that I want to go back to the tarot card thing. Like, can we treat this as tarot cards that can actually help us see things and intervene into things and imagine things differently, and that maybe is what's productive about it. So, Fred Jameson famously said, he was talking about somebody else saying it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, but now what we're imagining is the end of the world as the end of capitalism. So I wonder if there is something about ends and imaginings that's productive through this.
Yeah, well done. Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. It does at least remind me that I when I try to think about and talk about, I mean, one of the questions that always comes my way as someone who deals with Facebook as a subject so much is, well, why are you still on Facebook? And what about hashtag delete Facebook? And one of my answers to that is always some version of people want to be in conversation, and this is a platform where that happens. It's a decidedly tremendously problematic one, the way it's been erected, but I guess it also makes me think about the value of strange alternatives, or anything that makes these systems feel strange and unnormalizes the ways in which they've led us to follow the flows that they want most. So there's my attempt at following on some great optimism with a little bit from my side, I guess. Nimran, do you have another one?
Yeah, there's another question that might be a bit optimistic. I don't know. From now, Asher, if we do make these platforms public, nationalizing them, what are some of the challenges of implementation? Can we make them nationalized, I guess, as well?
Well, I think nationalization is not the only option, right? I mean, I think there are multiple forms of collectivity that are not just about nations, and nations, are a relatively recent social invention. So I think there are ways of inventing other kinds of social form that maybe go beyond the corporation, maybe go beyond the nation. And that's what we need to be looking into, experimenting with different forms of collectivity, different forms of communication structures that are not simply echoing, the Treaty of Westphalia, for instance, as the basis for human organization.
Yeah, I often think about what I know is that putting this kind of infrastructure in the hands of private corporations is absolutely not the answer to any of the problems that we face with them. Governments, nations that living in the United States have been tremendously problematic in the recent past. Not to mention beyond that, the entire history of the United States is tremendously problematic in the way it operates around the world and the way it operates within its own borders. What's missing is a notion, from my perspective, is a notion of the public. Like, it doesn't have to be a nation in control, but it needs to be the public in control. And governments are one way in which we've erected to try to have some broader control over the direction of a collective than simply monarchy or pick your alternative system. So I think this is part of what I end up thinking about is this moment we're in right now, where just the last few weeks, think about the last few weeks and Frances Haugen and as Joanna mentioned, kind of like the failure of Facebook a few weeks ago, it's revealing fragility. And as someone who interacts with tech journalism, tech journalists, as part of my work, watching tech journalists start to speak about and talk about critiques that many of us are well familiar with over a long period of time, I'm starting to hear people speak things that I wouldn't have ever expected them to maybe be talking about in terms of critiques of some of these technological infrastructures. It does make me wonder too. I mean, this may be going off a little bit of a veer, but and I'm happy to come back. But I'm thinking too about kind of what are the opportunities? I mean, we're at a moment where there's more awareness and visibility on kind of some of the failures of big tech, for example, and the ways in which they're operating in the world, where enough people have seen some outcome, if it's Brexit in the UK or if it's Trump in the United States, and just as a couple of examples, but even more recent, with thinking of Instagram and toxicity for teen girls and just the various kind of research findings that have now been leaked out of Facebook that one could have presumed they knew, but now it's on record as they did know. It makes me that's a question kind of back to the group. What are some opportunities you might see given this landscape to push further down that road of somehow, say, arguing for a notion of the public in this infrastructure, or alternative collective accountability structures, or auditing, algorithmic auditing, or anything along those lines? I'm curious kind of what you all see as possibility.
I think all of these things are certainly possible and desirable. Algorithmic audit is a really good set of techniques that people are developing and have been developing for a long time. I think the question of regulation is interesting, but again, it's regulation at multiple levels of interface through democracy, which is an extremely clumsy kind of system, and perhaps welcomely clumsy in some respects. But it's there are multiple kinds of difficulties with all of these systems as they interact and as they kind of play out various kind of inherited fallibilities that I think it's important not to put too much faith in any one of them, but just to learn more about the complex interplays between them, to find out how at a particular moment any kind of structure can be tilted in some way to produce new effects, but also to think, at the level of design, what are new systems that can be built, who can be brought in, what kind of social agencies, what kind of social capacities can be brought in to develop new kinds of system or new kinds of thinking that go beyond what we've got at the moment. So that wouldn't fall into the register of an optimism versus pessimism thing. It would be a question of like, okay, we live in extremely difficult times. We have to find some ways of working through them, and the ways that we work through them have cultural, aesthetic, political, and economic consequences. And let's think about them in a really rich sense. So I guess my claim would be let's develop a kind of vocabulary and a ways of thinking about technology and the wider systems and societies they're embedded in that is rich and supple enough to deal with the difficulties of the present. And it's the capacity to become adequate to the present that's the real problem. And it's a philosophical one, it's a political one, and it's an aesthetic as well as technical one.
So following on what Matthew just said, I'm sort of going to present like a practical example of something that can be done. It's not doesn't directly identify platforms, but it's a project I'm currently doing here in a major art center in Barcelona. It's called Centre d'Art Santa Monica. So they proposed to make a piece, and what I proposed to them is that they should use half the energy they used to use in previous exhibitions. So I cut the energy budget by half. Yeah. And it's super interesting because when I first proposed this to them, they said, okay, we need sensors and things that will regulate energy. And then, like to trigger all these things. I said, no, this doesn't have anything to do with technology. It's just to establish a new social contract within the museum. So we need to meet. So we do regular meetings. We call them negotiation tables, where we negotiate which things we're going to close and which things we're going to open. So basically we're closing the air condition, all lights. Like the opening day, we just shut down the air conditioning. It was incredibly hot. It was really interesting because it really visualized all this process. And it's been a really interesting process. It's super experimental. And this project was a reaction to a law that was approved in 2017 in the government in Catalonia. It's the climate change law, which established like a set of measures in order to reduce 0.5% the CO2 emissions by 2030. They didn't implement anything. They just implemented one tiny thing this day, right? So it's a bit like a counter reaction. And finally, like today, somebody from like an agency of cultural institutions here in Catalonia, he approached me, and they really want to see what we are doing right there, right? Because they said that we really lack imagination of how to interact, how to negotiate anything to achieve some sort of more decent, sustainable programs, right? Anyway, I think it's just like something, because it is possible, but I think we really lack the imagination to imagine this. It's even like, anyway, I didn't want to make it about the project, but just to expose like a practical example of something that could be done, which I think that a lot of other micro things could be done.
Yeah, one of the things that this gets me thinking about too, the problems of regulation. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few weeks. I feel like I've been seeing it talking about, along these lines of algorithmic auditing and what if there was some kind of visibility on the Facebook newsfeed algorithm, for example. And I've seen people whose work I've followed and who I've had affinity with in the past argue that that's just really not possible, that without having all of the data and all the information, that it's not really possible to audit or to really understand these algorithms. And I feel like, the regulation that we need is for some version of enforced transparency, that we don't have to know exactly how the Facebook algorithm. I don't have to be an expert in the Facebook algorithm. What I need is for the Facebook algorithm to be visible to the world. And then I feel fairly certain that someone who gets it will at least start to glean some information from it. Whereas if we ask governments to somehow determine exactly how a newsfeed algorithm should work or what it should be able to preference and not preference, that that's something they're not equipped to do. So it's really more, for me, it's more about the potential for visibility and transparency on what the companies have been able so far to rely on, which is proprietary and private and thus trade secret. And so you have no legal avenue to investigate.
Then you want to, there's another question. So should we go with the last question then?
Sure.
This one is from Menka, and they're asking, what advice, if any, do you have for parents thinking about what key messages, practices we want to prioritize sharing with our kids? And I guess if we could maybe try in one sentence, if possible, to answer that.
Well, I probably can't answer any question in one sentence, but, and I don't have children, but one thing I do note is how many of the people who build Silicon Valley technologies, for example, who do have children, don't let their children use the technologies they build. And that, I think that's a pretty important clue as to how profoundly they already understand the effects of what they build to be. And so whatever conversation one might have in that arena, I would suggest it needs to include some discussion of the things I often think about, which is, who is this technology for? And who does it make most vulnerable? Who does it make, who is it do the most for, and who's it do the least for? And often the person made most vulnerable by these systems are those who use them, and the people who benefit the most from them are those who built them.
Yeah, I would also say that there's a lot of good thinking around children and computer use that's been around for several decades. I mean, I think one of the things we can look at is the work that comes out of constructivist psychology, the people that follow from Vygotsky and others, that look at how the more a child can learn to develop complex interactions with the materials and to shape the scope and range and structure of their interaction with the technology, whether it's mud or code or paint or other kind of environment, whether it's a city space, the more valuable and rich their interaction can be. And I think that's something that we can look at as a way of thinking about it. I'm certainly not one of the people who would prohibit children from engaging with computers, but really to look for those spaces with computers that reward kind of rich engagement that is articulated on multiple levels. And you can think of kind of the early stages of Minecraft, for instance, as an environment that did that would be interactive as a game space, that was visual, that was social, but it also allowed you to code, to build spaces, to make Turing complete objects, and so on. So it was a very, very complex and interesting, but it would engage an environment that would engage you at a number of levels, yet not colonize you with social anxieties, which I think a lot of social media does. So it's something that gives you expressive capacity and expands your world, to use a kind of corny phrase, but that doesn't then recode your nervous system into something dependent upon its services.
I have no children. This is the best thing I've done for global climate change. Matthew, on the other hand.
Joanna, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, because I do have children. I have one. That's it. To staying here for the sake of climate. No, I really agree with Matthew. I don't think I can add anything further on. There is several sort of alternative video games that are much more about exploration. There is a wonderful Canadian studio that does amazing stuff. I can't remember the name. I'm so bad with names. End of Tales of, I don't know. Anyway, I can put it in the chat if I remember, which is wonderful. There is also this Italo-Brazilian studio called Moll Industry that they do a lot of incredible games. Also, they're also quite critique. So I think there is a lot of very good materials out there. And it just exactly what Matthew just said, right? Something that doesn't just colonize you with anxiety and with modes or more role models that they're not yours and you don't identify with, and they generate a lot of anxiety because you don't fulfill this, right? Which I think it's very, very easy to fall in this area. So yeah, I mean, they're not mainstream, but there is a lot of materials out there.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit further too, from my perspective, one of the things that led me to play with and have so much fun with computers when I first started doing that was the ability to manipulate and experiment. And Silicon Valley is all about producing interfaces, systems, platforms that are about consumption and prescribed interaction. And even if you're going to be on a social media platform, which I think has potential problems in terms of the things Matthew was talking about, there is opportunity to look at what that platform wants from you, and to then use that as a place from which to work against or to experiment, to not just take these systems the way they are, but to play in them, to experiment. And they don't really want that. They want you to do something that is predictable. So maybe the one sentence would be unpredictable.
Great. There's a few other comments on the chat, but I wonder if we should wrap it up with this, be unpredictable, and also together with this, the idea of less and imagination, less and imagination, as kind of points, takeaways from this. Just want to say again that on Saturday, Ben will be in the gallery giving a talk and a tour about the exhibition, and will be the last day. And that talk is going to be on our YouTube and on Arbeit on Screen next couple of days. Yeah. Anything else?
I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to have a conversation. I really appreciate getting to hear your all's thoughts and just think for a little bit with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.
I wish we could have done this like in London. No, it could have been very fun.
Next time.
Yeah. Now some dinner, some beers.
That's great.
Cool.
Right.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.